Carl Jung's final warning to empaths wasn't just another abstract theory buried in his notebooks, it was a terrifying revelation. He wrote of people who are feeding on your light, draining your very essence, often without you even realizing it. In those private notes, Jung described a psychological phenomenon so unsettling that he hesitated to publish it. What he discovered was that empaths, those with extraordinary emotional sensitivity, were systematically targeted by what he called unconscious energy parasites. But who are these predators? They aren't monsters in the obvious sense. They are often the people closest to you, those who arrive cloaked in charm, vulnerability, or wounds so deep that your heart aches to heal them. And yet Jung's chilling insight was this: their survival has become dependent on your energy, your compassion, your light. Pause for a moment. Think of the times you walked away from a conversation feeling inexplicably drained. Have you ever wondered why your body felt heavy, your mind foggy, or your spirit dulled? This is not coincidence, it is extraction. Nietzsche once warned that the man who fights monsters must take care lest he thereby become a monster. Empaths, in their attempt to heal, often do not see the shadow lurking behind the mask of those who seek their company. The most terrifying part of this process is its invisibility. It hides in emotional manipulation, disguised as love in trauma bonds, mistaken for intimacy in compassion, weaponized against you. Dostoevsky wrote that the soul is healed by being with children. But what happens when the child inside an adult never heals and instead clings desperately to the nearest empath demanding endless nourishment? The answer is stark. The empath becomes prey. These predators that Jung identified are not the obvious villains of mythology or fairy tales. They don't wear a mask of cruelty or announce themselves as destroyers. Instead, they often arrive as the wounded, the fragile, the ones who seem most in need of care. They are charming in their brokenness, persuasive in their pain. They tell you their story with such intensity that you feel chosen, perhaps even destined to be the one who finally heals them. But beneath this appearance lies a hunger that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. The feeding is invisible. It does not happen through force, but through subtle psychological mechanisms. It takes shape in trauma bonds that masquerade as deep connection in dependency, disguised as love in your empathy being transformed into a weapon against you. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." And here lies the danger. When an empath absorbs the despair of another, the dye begins to stain them too. Slowly, without realizing, they begin to wear the suffering of the predator as if it were their own. This is not coincidence. Empaths are not randomly attracting wounded souls. They are, as Jung explained, luminous beacons for those who have lost their own light. Think about it. A moth doesn't choose darkness. It flies instinctively to the flame. In the same way, those who are hollow within are drawn to the radiance of empaths. They do not come to grow. They come to feed. And the most chilling truth is this: they have perfected the art of appearing genuine. They may cry, confess, or collapse before you, but each display of pain is a silent hook. Their need awakens your compassion, and once compassion is awakened, you are caught. Machiavelli once warned that men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their inheritance. For energy parasites, the inheritance they crave is your vitality, your spirit, your life force, and they will cling to it with relentless desperation. So ask yourself, how many of your connections are true exchanges of love, and how many are silent siphonings of your energy? The answer may frighten you, but it is the beginning of awareness. This is Jung's forbidden message. Empaths aren't just unlucky in attracting difficult people. They are being actively hunted by those whose inner flame has long extinguished. These predators seek not money or status, but something far more vital: your light. And unless you learn to recognize their methods, you risk being consumed. Jung's work revealed something both tragic and profound. Empaths are not born fragile. They are forged. Their sensitivity is not an accident. It is a survival mechanism developed in the crucible of childhood trauma. The child who could read every micro-expression, who could sense the storm in a parent's voice before it erupted, who could predict emotional chaos and adapt, this child survived. What saved them then became their curse now. Modern neuroscience supports Jung's clinical observations. Studies on mirror neurons, the brain cells that allow us to feel what others feel, show that empaths' neural responses are far more intense than the average person's. Dr. Judith Orloff calls this the empath's supercharged radar, a system that doesn't just pick up signals, but practically merges with them. It's why empaths don't just notice another's sadness, they embody it sometimes more vividly than the person who actually feels it. But here's the tragic irony. The very gift that once kept them alive now makes them luminous targets for predators. In chaotic households, empathy was the shield. In adulthood, it becomes the bait. Predators sense this hyper-attunement and gravitate toward it because it promises them what they lack: emotional depth, spiritual vitality, and unconditional attention. Imagine this: you walk into a room full of people. Without speaking, the empath knows who is hurting, who is hiding something, who is on the verge of collapse. That sensitivity feels like a gift of the spirit, but to the energy parasite it is a flare in the night sky, signaling a source of endless supply. Dostoevsky once wrote, "The soul is healed by being with children." Yet the empath shaped in childhood is trapped in a paradox. They heal others as if they were children, while ignoring the wounded child within themselves. This is why so many empaths mistake being needed for being loved. They feel a rush of purpose when another leans on them, not realizing that their compassion has been hijacked. Nietzsche cautioned that he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. For the empath, that why becomes service to others. But when that service is consumed by parasites, the how becomes unbearable. This is the haunting truth Jung uncovered. Empaths are not simply unlucky, they are hunted. Once an energy parasite has recognized an empath, the real game begins not with overt control, but with the subtle exploitation of empathy itself. This is the parasite's genius. They don't fight your compassion, they enlist it. They don't silence your intuition, they twist it. They convince you that your very gift is the reason you must stay bound to them. Jung observed a terrifying pattern. The empath's compassion becomes the weapon used against them. The predator doesn't simply drain your energy, they reshape your perception until you doubt your own instincts. If you've ever told yourself, maybe I'm too sensitive, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe it's my fault, you have already stepped into the trap. This is what Jung described as the unconscious gaslight, when another's shadow convinces your consciousness that your intuition is the problem. Think about how devastating this reversal is. Your body gives you clear warnings: fatigue, anxiety, brain fog. But instead of listening, you dismiss them. You convince yourself exhaustion means love, depletion means devotion. You accept that constant sacrifice is proof of your worth. In this way, the parasite's emptiness is projected onto you, and you carry it as though it were your own. This is shadow projection reversal. Instead of recognizing their lack, they convince you that your endless giving is normal, that love must hurt, that boundaries are cruelty. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Yet under the parasite's influence, your thoughts no longer belong to you. They are shaped to maintain their feeding cycle. What makes this manipulation so dangerous is its subtlety. It does not announce itself. It feels like connection. It feels like intimacy. Trauma bonds masquerade as soul ties. Dependency disguises itself as destiny. Dostoevsky warned that man is sometimes extraordinarily passionately in love with suffering. The empath, through this inversion, learns to romanticize their pain, to wear depletion as a badge of honor. But ask yourself, when did compassion become exhaustion? When did care become captivity? These questions are the cracks in the parasite's spell. The moment you begin to ask them, the illusion begins to dissolve. Jung's notes describe the feeding process with almost surgical precision. It doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds in stages, each more insidious than the last, each designed to bind the empath tighter while draining them deeper. Stage 1. Light recognition. Energy parasites are instinctively drawn to empaths just as moths are drawn to flame. They can sense your openness, your willingness to give your glow. Narcissistic personalities, Jung observed, have an uncanny radar for identifying who in the room shines brightest. They are magnetized to the one who feels more than they take. Stage 2. The wound display. The predator never approaches with demands, they approach with pain. They share their trauma, their wounds, their sob stories with almost theatrical timing. Their brokenness feels real raw, and it ignites the empath's instinct to heal. Jung himself wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But these parasites have perfected a darker skill, becoming who you need them to be. Stage 3. Empathy activation. Once the hook is set, the extraction begins. Suddenly, there is always a crisis. They trauma dump for hours. They make you feel special. You're the only one who understands them. And because you mistake being needed for being loved, you give, and give, believing your devotion is intimacy. But what you are offering is not love, it is fuel. Stage 4. Depletion. Normalization. Here lies the most dangerous illusion. You begin to believe that exhaustion is proof of love, that constant overwhelm is what it means to be deeply connected. They convince you that your drained spirit is a badge of loyalty. In this stage, compassion has become captivity. Nietzsche warned, beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. At this stage, the empath risks merging with the predator's shadow. Giving endlessly, they start to lose their own light, their own identity, until they no longer know where they end and the parasite begins. This is not merely dysfunction, it is a pattern as old as human archetypes, the wounded healer locked in battle with the shadow devourer. And unless you awaken, you will not escape its gravity. Jung believed that behind every human role, every pattern, every relationship dynamic lies an archetype. And when it comes to empaths and energy parasites, the archetypes are clear and devastating: the wounded healer and the shadow devourer. The empath, the wounded healer, carries within them an unconscious drive to mend others, to restore what is broken, to absorb pain, as if their own suffering can somehow alchemize it. This archetype is ancient. In myth, the healer often bears wounds that never close, channeling their own pain into endless service. But Jung's insight was sobering. This same archetype, left unconscious, becomes the perfect bait for the shadow devourer. The shadow devourer is not evil in the fairy tale sense. They are not plotting your destruction in some conscious scheme. Instead, they are propelled by what Jung called the hunger of the shadow for wholeness. They sense in you everything they have exiled in themselves: authenticity, depth, emotional vitality. Instead of reclaiming these qualities within, they learn to consume them from others. Like a starving traveler who has forgotten how to grow food, they raid the gardens of those who still cultivate life. And here lies the empath's greatest vulnerability, their own shadow. Because every archetype has a shadow side, for empaths it is not cruelty or malice. It is the unconscious need to be needed. The terror of abandonment, the addiction to fixing others because usefulness feels safer than being seen. Marcus Aurelius once reflected, it is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. Yet many empaths are not truly living. They are surviving in cycles of endless giving, mistaking depletion for destiny. This is why predators are drawn to empaths like iron to a magnet. It is not because the empath is weak, it is because the empath carries the very qualities the parasite has disowned. But instead of inspiring healing, this dynamic locks them in a parasitic exchange. One gives endlessly, the other consumes insatiably. Ask yourself, is your compassion an act of love, or has it become your prison? The answer may be the first glimpse of your own shadow. On-sider the story of Anna and Daniel. Anna was a deeply sensitive woman who met Daniel during a wellness retreat. To her, he seemed different from the men she had known before, thoughtful, intense, wounded, in a way that awakened her healer's heart. He shared pieces of his past, the pain of a fractured childhood, struggles with depression, a search for meaning that seemed endless. Anna felt chosen, almost destined to be the one who could finally understand him. At first, it felt like love. Their conversations went late into the night, full of vulnerability and passion. Daniel told her she was the only one who truly saw him, and Anna's empathy swelled with pride. She mistook his need for intimacy, his dependency for devotion. But slowly, subtle signs began to emerge. After each conversation, Anna found herself exhausted, unable to focus. Her emotional reserves drained dry. Daniel began to call her constantly, often during her work hours, always with another crisis. He poured out his pain endlessly, trauma-dumping, venting, collapsing into her arms in every conversation. But when Anna tried to share her own struggles, he shifted the spotlight back to himself or minimized her pain with comparisons to his own suffering. Jung would have called this the archetype of the shadow devourer at work. What Daniel needed wasn't healing, it was supply endless emotional energy to sustain him. And Anna's mistake was the same one so many empaths make, believing that being indispensable is the same as being loved. When Anna finally began setting boundaries, protecting her time, conserving her energy, Daniel's mask slipped. He accused her of being cold, selfish, and uncaring. He said she wasn't the woman he thought she was. But the truth was simple, she had stopped being his emotional feeding source. And without her light, his shadow panicked, scrambling to find a new host. This story is not rare. It is the template by which many romantic relationships between empaths and parasites unfold. What feels like love is often dependency. What feels like destiny is often manipulation. The real question is how many of your relationships are truly reciprocal and how many are built on silent extraction. The dynamics of energy parasitism don't end with romance. They appear just as vividly in family bonds and professional environments, places where loyalty and obligation blur into silent chains of emotional captivity. Consider Michael a devoted son. His mother had always been emotionally intense, clinging to him with crisis after crisis. If he didn't answer the phone, she accused him of abandonment. If he tried to establish distance, she threatened despair, even suicide. From childhood, his empathy had been hijacked, conditioned into a lifelong duty to regulate her emotions. Jung would have recognized this immediately, the archetype of the devouring mother, the parent who unconsciously feeds on her child's life force instead of nurturing it. Michael's exhaustion was not evidence of being a bad son, it was evidence of being systematically drained. To create boundaries with her felt like betrayal, but in reality it was the only act of self-preservation. Now picture Elena in the workplace. She worked with a colleague who always seemed to be in crisis, personal drama, bleeding into every meeting, emotional outbursts, turning routine projects into spectacles of urgency. This colleague sought Elena out constantly, framing their behavior as sensitivity, as being the only one who truly feels in a cold, corporate world. At first, Elena's natural compassion made her listen, console, and take on tasks to lighten the load. But over time, she realized what was happening. Her energy was being siphoned into endless emotional labor, with nothing given back. Jung would have called this projection. The colleague, unable to manage their own emotions unconsciously, forced everyone else to carry them, positioning themselves as the victim, while Elena became the caretaker. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Yet in this environment, Elena's mind was no longer her own. It was consumed by someone else's storms. These patterns reveal the painful truth. Parasites aren't always lovers in disguise. They can be mothers who mistake guilt for love, or co-workers who camouflage irresponsibility as depth. And unless you learn to see the feeding for what it is, you risk being trapped in roles that drain you, child savior, rescuer, until there is nothing left to give. At the heart of Jung's warning lies a devastating psychological trap. Empaths are conditioned to believe that love equals sacrifice. From childhood, they learn that their value comes not from simply existing, but from serving, fixing, and absorbing the pain of others. Over time, this belief crystallizes into an unconscious law: to be loved, I must deplete myself. This is the silent creed that binds empaths to parasites. Every act of giving, every sleepless night spent consoling, every boundary crossed in the name of compassion reinforces the illusion that devotion is measured in exhaustion. And yet what Jung saw with piercing clarity was this: when your light becomes food for another, you are not practicing love, you are practicing self-erasure. Think of the last time you left someone's presence feeling drained, heavy, or emotionally fogged. Did you tell yourself you were just too sensitive? Did you dismiss your exhaustion as overthinking? This is how the trap sustains itself. The body sends signals: fatigue, anxiety, emotional overwhelm, but the mind, conditioned by years of trauma, silences them. You are taught to distrust yourself, to believe that compassion must hurt. This inversion of love is what Jung called the shadow at work. Instead of becoming conscious of your wounds, you replay them in service of others. You enter what modern psychologists describe as spiritual bypassing, focusing on healing others so you can avoid the terrifying task of healing yourself. In this way, the parasite becomes your enabler. They give you endless drama so you don't have to face your own emptiness. They give you someone to save so you don't have to save yourself. Nietzsche warned, sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. For the empath, the illusion is that depletion equals love. Destroy that illusion, and the entire feeding cycle collapses. But holding on to it means living in a perpetual martyrdom, mistaking servitude for intimacy. Ask yourself, are you truly loving, or are you avoiding your own healing by pouring into others? Until that question is answered with honesty, the trap remains closed. Jung never left us with only warnings. He also pointed to the path of transformation, the way an empath could protect their light without hardening their heart. I call it the LIGT method, a framework that turns unconscious, giving into conscious sovereignty. L. Learn to discern energy signatures. Jung spoke of feeling toned complexes, the emotional charge that people carry and transmit. Empaths already sense this, but often dismiss it. Begin noticing how your body feels around others. With energy parasites, you leave drained, anxious, or fogged. With healthy souls, you leave clearer, lighter, inspired. Your nervous system is a radar, trust it. I. Integrate your shadow. The shadow, Jung said, is everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. For empaths, this shadow often hides the addiction to being needed, the fear of abandonment, the unconscious belief that love must be earned. Ask yourself, what do I gain from rescuing others? What wound am I trying to heal in them that actually belongs to me? By bringing these drives into the light, you stop being ruled by them. G. Guard your sacred energy. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. For the empath, strength begins with boundaries. Protecting your energy is not selfish, it is spiritual responsibility. Say no to emotional labor that leaves you depleted. Refuse to carry what is not yours. Every no you give to parasitism is a yes to your growth. H. Honor your authentic nature. Parasites thrive on empaths who dim themselves to be acceptable. Jung's principle of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, means shining without apology. Your sensitivity is not weakness. Your intuition is not overthinking. Your light is not too much. Own it, or others will consume it. T. Transform trauma into wisdom. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This includes accepting that your gift was forged in trauma. You can feel deeply without losing yourself. You can care without collapsing. You can transform empathy from an unconscious survival tool into a conscious act of love." The LIGT method doesn't ask you to stop being compassionate. It teaches you to wield compassion with intention. It reminds you that your light was never meant to be consumed. It was meant to illuminate your own path first. When an empath begins to reclaim their light, the parasite doesn't simply fade away. Instead, the feeding cycle intensifies. Jung warned of this escalation. The moment the empath resists, the parasite unconsciously fights to maintain its source of survival. I call this the extinction burst of the shadow. At first, it shows up as guilt. After everything I've shared with you, you're going to abandon me. Then shame. I thought you were more compassionate than this. Then fear. You're being selfish, you'll end up alone. These are not casual words. They are psychological weapons designed to hook you back into the cycle. Parasites will create bigger crises, demand more urgent attention, even threaten self-destruction if you stop giving them your energy. Machiavelli once wrote, "Men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear." The energy parasite exploits both. They play on your love by performing neediness, and they manipulate your fear by suggesting that without you, they cannot survive. The empath, terrified of abandonment and trained to equate love with sacrifice, often yields. But Jung's antidote was clear consciousness. When you recognize these tactics for what they are, their power dissolves. What feels like cruelty in setting a boundary is actually evidence of your growth. The louder the parasite protests, the more certain you can be that your sovereignty is working. Think of it like this: a drowning man may thrash harder as you swim away, but if he has been pulling you under, letting go is the only way to save both your lives. Empaths must remember, You are not abandoning anyone by refusing to be consumed. You are forcing them to face their own shadows instead of outsourcing them onto you. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. The extinction burst is nothing more than an outside event, a desperate reaction. Hold firm, see it clearly. The escalation is proof that you are no longer prey. This stage feels like war, but it is not a war against them, it is a war for your soul. The true awakening of an empath is not about shutting down or building walls. It is about stepping into sovereignty. Jung saw 3 stages of empathic development: the unconscious empath, who feels everything but understands nothing; the conscious empath, who begins to use their gift with awareness; and finally, the sovereign empath, who embodies empathy as strength rather than burden. At the first stage, you absorb others' emotions without realizing it, blaming yourself for being too sensitive. At the second, you recognize your gift and start protecting it with boundaries, though guilt still lingers. At the third, you own your empathy as a spiritual capacity you can feel deeply without being consumed, and you attract conscious people who can meet you as equals. This is the path from prey to sovereign. But sovereignty comes with a cost. To rise, you must be willing to disappoint. You must disappoint the lovers who depended on your exhaustion, the parents who fed on your loyalty, the colleagues who thrived on your emotional labor. You must be willing to walk away from connections built on depletion. As Jung warned, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming who you truly are means refusing to play the role others demand. This is where many falter, because sovereignty requires loneliness, at least at first. You must be willing to be disliked, misunderstood, even abandoned by those who preferred you weak. But what you gain is liberation. You stop confusing being drained with being loved, being needed with being valued, being depleted with being devoted. You begin to see that your light was never meant to be fuel for others' darkness. It was meant to illuminate your own path, and by doing so, to inspire others to kindle their own flame. Jung's final warning was simple. They are feeding on your light, but his promise was greater. You have the power to stop them, not by dimming yourself, but by awakening. When you guard your energy, when you honor your authenticity, when you transform your wounds into wisdom, you no longer attract those who consume. You attract those who create, those who reciprocate, those who rise with you. This is the sovereign empath, not prey, not victim, but a beacon, unafraid, unbroken, and finally free.